It was a muggy Tuesday morning in August when Richard Nelson, the newly appointed police chief of Blue Ridge, North Carolina, stepped out of his car wearing a plaid shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed sneakers. To the world, he looked like an ordinary man, but beneath that humble exterior stood 2 decades of law enforcement experience. A man who had faced chaos, corruption, and prejudice in every uniform he'd ever worn. He wasn't there for applause or formality. Today wasn't about shaking hands or giving speeches. It was about truth, the kind you can only see when the masks come off. Blue Ridge had a reputation, whispers of misconduct, racism, and power abused behind closed doors. And Richard, a black man stepping into leadership, wasn't naive. He knew change couldn't start with paperwork or policy. It had to start with exposure. So he came undercover not as a chief, but as a stranger. As he walked through the precinct's parking lot, officers passed by, some laughing, some side-eyeing him with the casual suspicion reserved for people who don't belong. Richard adjusted his cap, steadying his breath. This wasn't just an inspection. This was a test of the department and of himself. What he didn't know yet was that before the hour was over, one man's arrogance would turn this quiet experiment into a defining moment of justice. Inside the precinct, fluorescent lights buzzed above like judgmental eyes. The air smelled of stale coffee and old arrogance. Richard moved quietly, observing clusters of officers chatting, laughing, reviewing paperwork, or pretending to. He studied them like pieces of a puzzle, each glance, each whisper revealing more than words ever could. Then came the voice, sharp, cocky, laced with disdain. "Hey, you!" Richard turned. A tall white officer with a smug grin swaggered toward him. The badge on his chest read Daniels. Behind him, a few others leaned on desks, smirking, ready for entertainment. "You lost, old man. This isn't a shelter," Daniels sneered. A ripple of laughter echoed behind him. Richard met his eyes, calm, steady, unflinching. "Just taking a look around," he said evenly. But Daniels stepped closer, his smirk widening. "We don't need people like you hanging around here," he said. The others chuckled. The moment thickened. Then, without warning, Daniels did something no one in that room would forget. He spat right in Richard's face. The room erupted in laughter, the sound hollow and cruel. Time slowed. Richard froze not from shock, but from restraint, the kind only a man who's fought real battles can master. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and calmly wiped his cheek. His voice, low and steady, cut through the noise like a blade. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" Daniels grinned. "Only the ones who don't belong." The laughter continued, but in that instant, Richard decided the mask was about to come off. Minutes later, the intercom crackled to life. "All personnel report to the briefing room." The officers filed in, still chuckling, still unaware that their laughter had already sealed a man's fate. Richard slipped into a side entrance, now holding a folder embossed with the department's seal. Captain Harris, a stout man with tired eyes, stood at the front. "We've got an important introduction today," he announced. "As you know, Chief Caldwell retired last month. It's time you meet your new leader." The chatter quieted. Daniels leaned against the wall, arms crossed, smirking, oblivious. Harris smiled toward the side door. "Please welcome Chief Richard Nelson." The room froze. The smirk died on Daniels' lips. The man he had just mocked, the man he had spat on, stepped forward with slow, deliberate steps. Richard placed the folder on the lectern and looked out at a sea of wide eyes and pale faces. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady. "As of today, I am your new chief of police." Silence hit the room like thunder. Daniel's face flushed crimson, his arrogance collapsed into shame. Richard paused, letting the gravity of the moment sink in. When I arrived this morning, he continued, I came in plain clothes because I wanted to see this department for what it truly is. His gaze locked on Daniel's. What I saw was eye-opening. The air in the room thickened with guilt and fear. Every officer could feel the weight of judgment pressing down. In just a few minutes, Richard said slowly, I witnessed behavior that doesn't just break policy, it breaks humanity. He stepped closer to the podium, voice rising like a storm. Respect isn't optional. It's the foundation of everything we stand for. Without it, we fail not just as officers, but as people. He let the silence linger, watching eyes dart to the floor. Daniel swallowed hard, shifting under the heat of the moment. Richard took a breath. This morning, some of you laughed as a man was humiliated, but what you didn't realize was that man is standing B. Before you now, and let me make this clear, that kind of behavior ends today. The room stayed silent, no one daring to move. You wear a badge that represents service and sacrifice, Richard continued, but if you can't show basic decency, you dishonor that badge. Every word was a hammer striking truth into steel. Daniel's eyes dropped. His arrogance, once his armor, now felt like chains. Richard's voice softened, but his tone carried command. Officer Daniels stepped forward. The man hesitated. You spat in my face, Richard said evenly, and in doing so you spat on the oath you swore to uphold. Daniels opened his mouth. Chief, I didn't know. Exactly, Richard cut in. You didn't care to know. The silence cracked. Every officer stood frozen. This department has been poisoned by arrogance, bias, and neglect, Richard said, turning to the rest. And that ends now. He paced slowly, his footsteps echoing like a judge's gavel. I've fought for justice my entire life, not just on the streets, but within walls like these, and I won't let this department become another cautionary tale. His words rang heavy with authority. Effective immediately, Officer Daniels is suspended pending investigation, Richard declared. Gasps swept across the room. Let this be clear, he continued. This isn't punishment, it's precedent. From this moment forward, accountability will not be optional. Daniels stood motionless, face pale, eyes darting for escape. If you're not here to serve with integrity, Richard said, voice deep with conviction, then you don't belong here. He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the room. But if you're ready to rebuild, to serve with honor, then we start today. For the first time, the officers saw not a stranger, but a leader, a man who demanded not submission, but respect. Days turned into weeks, and the precinct was no longer the same. The laughter that once mocked weakness now echoed with humility. Officers who had looked away before now straightened their backs when Richard walked by. Change didn't come easy, it never does, but it began to take root. Officer Reyes, a young recruit, approached Richard one afternoon. Chief, she said softly, I used to stay quiet because I was scared of retaliation, but not anymore. I want to do better. Richard smiled faintly. That's all I ask, he said. Change starts with you. But not everyone welcomed reform. Daniels filed an appeal calling it unfair treatment. Internal Affairs reviewed his file, years of complaints buried under silence, and denied it. Word spread fast. The days of power without accountability were over. Some officers left, others adapted, but the tone had shifted. For the first time in years, the precinct felt like it was breathing again, not from fear, but from purpose. Months later, Richard attended a community outreach event, part of his promise to rebuild trust. The gym buzzed with families, laughter, and cautious hope. A small boy no older than 7 approached him, tugging at his sleeve. Are you really the chief? He asked shyly. Richard knelt to his level, smiling. I am. The boy hesitated. My dad says the police don't care about us. The words hit deep, heavier than any insult ever could. Richard looked him in the eyes. "I can't change the past," he said quietly, "but I promise we're trying to do better, and if you ever need help, you come find me." The boy nodded, smiling for the first time. That moment, small and human, was why Richard had taken this job, not for titles, not for power, but for change that reached the hearts of those who had stopped believing in justice. By the end of his first year, Blue Ridge was different, not perfect, but better. Officers treated one another with respect. The community began to trust again, and the echoes of laughter that once mocked now carried something purer: unity. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rolling hills, Richard stood in the precinct hallway watching his officers head home. Their laughter was different now, genuine, grounded, kind. He exhaled, a mix of exhaustion and pride in his chest. Change had come slowly, painfully, but it had come. Power abused had been humbled. Integrity had taken root. He looked around at the place that had once been broken and smiled faintly. "It's a start," he whispered, "because real change doesn't roar, it rises." Quietly, consistently, one act of courage at a time. And if this story reminds you that standing for what's right still matters, then don't just listen, act. Speak up when it's uncomfortable. Stand tall when silence is easy. Because justice doesn't begin in the courtroom, it begins in the heart of those brave enough to demand it.